Hi, everyone. It's a morning or evening or afternoon, wherever you might be joining us from, but great to see everyone. Welcome to the third third lecture in the Herb Lubalin lecture series for the fall of 2023 edition. My name is Alexander. I'm one of the instructors in the TypeCulture program, and we're excited to welcome you to another talk. The Herb Lubalin lecture series is presented by Cooper Union, the Herb Lubalin Study Center, and TypeCulture. The lectures are part of the extended program in typeface design that TypeCulture runs, and we're a few weeks from closing out the first term of the 3-term program. So this lecture is very much kind of embedded into the lecture series. So it's wonderful to have all of you with us. I wanted to take a moment to thank TypeCulture for their generosity in allowing us to record this lecture and all of the previous lectures we've had. TypeCulture is an award-winning type foundry, and it is also a wonderful, incredibly rich academic resource. It hosts a directory, archive, and educational aid for students, educators, professionals who are seeking information about type. Check out TypeCulture. If you're not familiar with them, I will do my usual double duty of linking everything I can into the chat, so we make it fully interactive. You can see the archive of the past recordings at these two links, coopertype.org/lectures. You can kind of scroll down the page and see the past events we've had. The lectures are embedded right into those pages. You can also go to our dedicated section of Vimeo, and you can find all of that information, all of these lectures there as well. There are the links in the chat as well. So we have an incredibly rich catalog of lectures. So thanks again to TypeCulture for allowing us to continue adding to that collection. I wanted to bring up the announcement of the last lecture for the fall. I guess it would be technically in winter time, but we would be having our final 4th lecture on December 4th, same time, same place, Monday, on Zoom webinar. It would be 12:30 Eastern Standard Time, exactly as it is right now. The lecture will be presented by Alexei Chekhov, who will be speaking about the relationship of Cyrillic and Ukrainian typography, sort of that intertwining kind of relationship between those two, between the script and Ukrainian history of design and typography. So join us for that. The information to register is here. If you want to take a screenshot, you can follow that QR code, but it's basically coopertype.org/lectures. You can find the announcement for that as soon as we get the details for that lecture. It's trickling in, so we should have that posted for you shortly. But for the time being, save the date for December 4th. I also wanted to mention a quick housekeeping note. We will have a Q&A at the end. So when you have questions, make sure to use the Q&A function. Just click that QA icon on the bottom of your Zoom. It'll bring up a window and put questions in there. We might not see the questions if they come in chat, so just remind, if you feel free to converse in the chat, but if you have specific questions, use the Q&A function. And also just a very quick note about the chat window. It does have 2 toggles in the blue where it says 2. By default, it typically says host and panelists, so make sure to switch that to everyone. Host and panelists is only visible by the tech crew, but everyone will be visible by everyone else. So if you have comments, feel free to send them along. If you have technical notes, use the host and panelist function, but everyone is probably the default that you want. So make sure that's set to that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker today. We're very lucky to have Dr. Joel Gage with us, who is a scholar of history of printing, and he's the custodian of the John M. Wing Foundation on the History of Printing at the Newberry Library in Chicago. It's a position she has held since 2016. She has curated a number of exhibitions at the library, most recently a show of handwriting in the age of print, in 2022. She's currently working on 2 forthcoming exhibitions, one on immigrant printing in Chicago, which is slated for next year, 2024, and another exhibition on pre-Gutenberg printing, which is slated for 2027. Dr. Jill Gage earned a BA and an MA in English at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She holds an MS in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois, and a PhD in English from the University of London. I'm very excited and very, very glad to have Jill with us presenting this talk. Is it Type? 500 Years of Fooling the Reader. Without further ado, I'll switch it over to Jill. Thank you so much, Jill, for being here presenting.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone so much for being here, and to the team at Cooper Union for inviting me. It's a great honor to do something in conjunction with Cooper Union. One of my favorite collections that I oversee at the Newberry is that of George Salter, who was a calligrapher and book designer who taught at Cooper Union. So even to be in that same universe is completely humbling for me. So, sorry. So I will begin by referencing another past speaker at Cooper Union by saying the facts with which I shall deal this afternoon are mainly old and familiar, nor is there anything new in the general use I shall make of them. If there shall be any novelty, it will be in the mode of presenting the facts and the inferences and observations following that presentation. So some of you might know that as the opening of Abraham Lincoln's 1860 address to Cooper Union. And I think it's actually a really great disclaimer for this talk, in that I'm not going to be presenting anything paradigm shifting. I don't know that I ever present anything paradigm shifting, but I think this has been a topic that I've been really interested in for a couple of years. And I've had the opportunity to think about it a lot lately, and I have really welcomed the opportunity to think about it more with everyone here today. So I probably should have called the talk, "Is it print?" instead of "Is it type?" but that's okay. We're going to push through that. And what I first thought that I would do quickly today is I'm going to show you 20 unidentified slides, 20 unidentified images on 10 slides. And I'd like you to think about whether they are print or manuscript. And I want you to think about why you think that, what clues make you think that, if you can see any clues. I'll try to go quickly, but not too quickly so people can see. If you think it's print, can you guess the technology? So is it woodblock, metal type, engraving, something else? And finally, if by seeing something online, is it more difficult for you to figure out if something is print or manuscript, or is it easier? And I'm actually really, really curious. So I would love to know at the end what you thought was difficult and easy. So this was the image on the advertisement for the talk. So maybe some of you have figured out what it is, and at least one person has spoiled this on Twitter this morning, or X, I suppose. Some of these are old and some of these are new finds for me. Some of them are old favorites. Some of them, I did pick these sort of randomly. They're all items in the Newberry's collection. I did pick them randomly. I would say I love them all for various reasons. And I had a really good time looking through them. I maybe should not have used 20 of them, but I have hundreds of thousands of things to choose from the collection. I'm curious, for example, what people think about color, if color is harder or easier. And I tried not to think about things too much when I paired them together. This one, I will say, is particularly and surprisingly hard for me every time I look at it. I tried also not to, I didn't really mean to trick people here, but this one I always feel is somewhat tricky, but I don't know why. I will also say that sometimes if you actually read the item, it gives it away, but that's okay as well. I know I'm going through these at a slightly irregular pace, but we will go back to these. This is the first thing that I ever really, the book on the left is the first thing that I ever really, really loved at the Newberry. And number 16 is one of my newest acquisitions. I just acquired it this past year. So after I go through all of these, I should say, or I should have said already, I'm going to take a little break and I'm going to give you a little history of the John M. Wing collection at the Newberry. I suspect, and if anybody gets the one on the top wrong, I think I'm going to be really quite upset or disappointed. I don't think anybody will. But after this, what I'm going to do is we're going to take a little break. And this one was maybe a little unfair, but that's okay. I'm going to take a little break and I'm going to tell you about the history of the Wing collection. I suspect that many of you, at least, are not too familiar with the Wing collection at the Newberry. And so I welcome the chance to share it with you. And I think that will also give you an insight into why I'm interested in this and how this topic developed. So the John M. Wing collection on the history of printing is one of the most important history of printing collections in the world. It is basically beginnings to present. So for Doctor Who fans, I always say that I'm a time lord of curators and that I go anywhere in time and place. The oldest thing in the collection is this woodblock printing. So this is in the Newberry's, this is an image of something that's in the Newberry's collection. I did grab these images from the Met because I didn't have one of the Newberry's, but it's exactly the same thing. This is a woodblock printed charm from Japan in the 8th century. They were rolled up and put in these wooden pagodas, and then they were put in temples throughout Japan. It's from the 8th century. I was really excited when I found that we had one of these because I'm doing a pre-Gutenberg exhibition. And then I learned that there were 1 million of these printed. So it kind of took the air out of my sails a little bit. A lot of them survived because they were in temples, but they're still really fascinating, I think. We have about 2,500 specimens of incunables or pre-1501 printing. I also am an English lit person, English lit and history, so I always go to the Caxton, even though he's far from my favorite 15th century printer. I also collect I go through contemporary artist books, sort of very narrowly within the parameters of the history of printing. So I always look for things that are typographical or have interesting letter forms or some kind of interesting printing processes. I'm fascinated, as you'll hear in a little bit, about recreations of handwriting or reproductions of handwriting. So I was very interested in this embroidered notebook. We also have the best collection of printed writing manuals in the world. So printed writing manuals, for those who don't know, are basically printed books that tell people how to make manuscripts. I still sometimes have a hard time wrapping my head around this idea. This is one of my favorites, though. This is an engraved book from a Dutch writing master in the 17th century, David Rollins. We also collect contemporary calligraphy, and in the past year, we have started receiving the papers of the San Francisco calligrapher Thomas Ingmeier, who's one of the most important contemporary American calligraphers. He's incredibly innovative and imaginative with his calligraphy. He never does the same thing twice. He's always trying something new, and he's really interested in pushing the boundaries of letter forms. And, thinking about, why does an A have to look like an A? I feel like I've learned so much from Thomas about letter forms in general, and his notebooks have been such a wonderful addition to the Newberry, along with his correspondence and his teaching notes. So I could not be more thrilled. I personally am really interested in all kinds of printing technologies, and right now I'm interested in printing and disability, and especially in printing technologies for the blind. This was a gift of a Braille Playboy from a few years ago. We have lots of examples of pre-Braille printing systems for the blind, but everybody always likes the Braille Playboy, which was truly read just for the articles. As one would expect from a history of printing collection, we have lots of great type specimens, including this one cut in the 1520s by Origi for Tricino. Lots of more standard type specimens like Bedoni on the left and Barnhart Brothers, which was a Chicago foundry. I think there's a lot of work that could be done on type specimens. I think it's a fascinating genre in itself, and I think there's lots of room there for people to work on things. We also have some papers from type designers and printers and drawings, including some drawings and proofs for Bruce Rogers's Centaur. And we also, as I said, have the papers of George Salter, which is really an incredible collection of his original art. And so here we have his original sketch on the left, and then his first sort of draft in the middle, and the final piece. I think these are a wonderful resource, and having original art for book jackets is so rare, but also I think he was such an astounding artist that it's, I think, one of the jewels of our collection. We have some type and woodblocks and plates and things like that. Not too much, just enough to we're not like that's not the point of the collection, but it's nice to have a teaching collection, kind of just to show people. This is a set of early 19th century punches. And a couple of years ago, I just happened to find for sale online 2 of the ledger books for this foundry. So I was really excited to get that because it shows who bought this type, what they bought, how much they paid for, how much it costs to run the foundry. So again, I think this could be like a really exciting project for somebody if you like ledger books. So how did all this come to be at the Newberry? It's all thanks to this man on the left, John Mansfield Wing, who was born in New York, but came to Chicago in the 1860s as a journalist and a compositor and a printer. This is him with a friend of his who's also a printer, and they're actually holding up type that spells out their name. That's what they're holding in their hands. So Mr. Wing published a lot of things like popular trade journals. He had a real estate magazine called The Landowner and one on brewing called The Western Brewer. He published things like travel guides to Chicago. He was successful enough that he retired as a multimillionaire at the age of 44. And then proceeded to spend most of the rest of his life sitting in the library making extra illustrated books. So extra illustrated books are books which have had, technically speaking, they're books that have had something added to them by someone other than the publisher, so usually the owner. And it can be anything from a single frontispiece to thousands of maps or engravings or postcards or whatever. And they're kind of like 19th century hypertext, and that they could just go on forever. And the ultimate extra illustrated book would have an illustration for every noun. Mr. Wing was sort of unusual, so he made 376 volumes. He made these fake title pages that were really all about himself, and then he often included a decorated initial cut from elsewhere. He almost always included a photograph frontispiece of himself reading Rabelais, which I think is really strange. So this is actually what brought me to the library as a grad student. I wrote a master's thesis on these. He added, some of the things he added were quite typical, like engraved portraits. Some things, sometimes he included high-end things. This is a manuscript letter. I think it's from Louis the 15th. But he also included things like an entire Marshall Field's hosiery catalog from 1910, which is not what you would expect to find in these books. And he ultimately included a postcard of the cemetery where he is now buried. So they're really fascinating documents, and they're strange. They're very strange. He was really into this idea of making books with his hands. He hated 19th century books, and he thought beautiful books could only be made by hand, literally by cutting up other books and putting them together. He was a collector. He was a book collector, but he wasn't a collector in the same way that like Henry Huntington or the Folgers were. So we didn't seed the Wing collection with his own books. He was kind of a gentleman collector, but it was okay. But when he died, Mr. Wing died in 1917, he left his money to the building of a bibliographical collection. He wanted a bibliographical collection. The first curator of the collection was Pierce Butler, who we see here. My immediate predecessor, Paul Gale, always calls Butler the electric curator because it looks like he's plugged into the wall. Butler was interested in incunables, and he really thought that the way that you built a great typographical collection was with incunables. And he set out, because everyone in the 15th century had, you had to make or have made your own typefaces. You couldn't buy them at a foundry. And so he set out to collect a specimen from every printer working in the 15th century. And he just about succeeded, or he got a lot of the way through that project. So here we see Caxton again. There's lots of really interesting things here. Here's one of my favorites, which is from Gunther Zehner in Augsburg, 1474, who had this really unusual like pearl font on some things, bubble font. I think it's really unusual and interesting. So he was just buying incunables by the truckload. There was one year that he also bought things like this block book. This is technically listed as the first thing the Wing collection ever bought, but that's not strictly true. This block book was printed, even though it's post-Gutenberg, it's printed with woodblocks, so even the text is woodblocks. So perhaps an early example of fooling the reader. One year he had a kind of a bad year and was only able to buy like 60 incunables. So to make up for that loss, he bought the entire run of the Kelmscott press, which is also kind of crazy. I will say that we did end up eventually acquiring a couple incunables that were owned by William Morris, including this one here, which always strike me as wonderfully Kelmscottian. Like you can really see the influence on him. So the second curator was this man, Ernst Dederer, who probably has had the most influence on the way that I think about the collection, or how I've been thinking about it recently. He was a printer and a type designer and a teacher. He taught at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. He was also a calligrapher and was part of the great calligraphy revival, lettering revival of the early 20th century. He was a student of Edward Johnston. So this is a lettering sheet that Edward Johnston sent to Harry Kessler, as in Kranich Press, Harry Kessler. And Dederer was like, incunables are okay, but first of all, we could buy 16th century books too. But he really was very adamant that if you're interested in typography, you had to also be interested in calligraphic letter forms, because calligraphic letter forms influence typographic letter forms. And he was also a type designer, and he did some designs for Ludlow, including Eusebius/Nicholas Jensen, which Dederer started, and his student Robert Hunter Middleton eventually finished. Detter was also really interested in inscription. He did rubbings of columns in Rome, like Trajan rubbings, and we have those. They're always really difficult to look at. This one happens to be backed, so it's a little easier. And because you can see his influence in things like these sets, we have 3 different sets of geometrically constructed alphabets from the 15th century. So you can start to see where Detter's influence really comes in here, and what letters looked like, what they looked like before typography or metal type, and what they looked like after, and how those things worked together. He was also really interested in handwriting and writing manuals. He didn't necessarily buy these, but I think it's really because of him and his interest in calligraphy and the fact that he was a calligrapher that we really collect in earnest writing manuals. And if you're keeping track, the one on the top is an engraved book, an engraved printed book, and the one on the bottom is a manuscript. So Detter died suddenly in 1944, unexpectedly at least. And so the collection was sort of unofficially turned over to Stanley Morrison for a few years. So I will definitely say that I wake up every day knowing that I have totally failed in comparison with Stanley Morrison. This is my favorite picture of him with Beatrice Ford's cat. She wrote to George Salter that it was really hard to get Morrison to smile. So I like this one quite a lot. Unfortunately, Stanley Morrison and I have a lot of the same interests, but he has just written the definitive book about everything, like Italian writing books, for example. But despite the fact that he was never officially a curator running the collection, we see his influence a lot. We also ended up acquiring a lot of his books. These are both from his own collection. So the one on the left is a lace pattern book, and the other is his copy of Palatino's 1548 writing book. He wrote in it that it was one of the few books that survived the Blitz. He hired the 3rd curator, who's a man named Jim Wells, you see here, who's very young and liked to smoke cigars in the library. And Jim, I think, inherited a really strong community from Detterer. So I should also say that the Wing collection was designed from the beginning to be a working library for printers and designers. It wasn't necessarily designed for scholars, even though that's maybe who uses it more today. So designers and printers came in, they were always in the building. They were always working with our collection. And in time, they themselves gave their collection. So when Jim Wells came into the job, Newberry also had started collecting archival materials. So he was able to acquire the collection, some of that first group of people who had used the library, including Robert Hunter Middleton, who we see, this is one of his pieces for 27 Chicago designers. We acquired the papers of Oswald Cooper, as in Cooper Black. Again, if you're keeping track, this is a drawing for Cooper Black. Cooper was originally a lettering artist, and I always like the drawings for Cooper Black better than the actual typeface. There's sort of a vitality and a bounciness to them that gets lost, I think, in the type. We also acquired things like 145 Buick blocks. These again were used by Robert Hunter Middleton to print in the mid-century, and so we also ended up acquiring his make-readies that he used to print them, which I think are really interesting. Jim Wells continued collecting writing books alongside Philip Hofer's in the Hofer collection at Harvard. And they actually had a system where they worked together so as not to drive up prices. And this is an engraved writing book by Marie Pavy. It's one of the 2 earliest writing books by women. And then my immediate predecessor is somebody many of you, or some of you at least in the audience, probably know well, Paul Gale. So here I couldn't resist this photo of him with Herman and Gudrun Zapf, and then just sort of wandering the stacks by himself. And Paul continued creating very strong collections within the design community in Chicago, really bolstering our collection of artist books. and really growing the collection in so many ways. When I took over the collection in 2016, I was slap bang in the middle of curating a Shakespeare exhibition. So this is, I think, maybe the day that I learned that I had gotten the curatorial position. And I have just tried to keep up with the 4 giants on whose shoulders I stand. So I'm really lucky. I have an amazing collection to work with every day. And I've been at the Newberry, I've been curator since 2016, but I've worked at the Newberry since 2000. So I've really cut my teeth on the collection here. And I have a very Newberry sense of the history of printing, for better or worse. So a couple years ago, I was asked to do an exhibition on handwriting. And as I got into it, I realized that what I was really interested in was handwriting in print. So reproductions of handwriting in print, recreations of it, who made it, why did they make it, how did they make it? And that's kind of what leads me to where I am today, because I started thinking, like, how did people see handwriting in print in the 16th and 17th century? Did they know it was printed? Did they think it was manuscript? How did that work? What was the relationship between people in the print trade who were making this? So let's go on to the answers. So you probably could have guessed the thing on the left, the book on the left. It's 1 page of manuscript. It's what we call a pen facsimile from our earliest Shakespeare quarto, the 1598 Love's Labour's Law. So there's just a page missing at one point, and somebody was hired or commissioned to make a reproduction of the page. So again, I've worked at the Newberry for 24 years. It was only a few years ago that somebody pointed out this was a manuscript. So I think this is a particularly hard one. Even if you see it alongside the other pages, it doesn't help. Many of you probably know the thing on the right is the type specimen for Mistral, the Roger Excafon metal typeface of 1953, which I think is just an extraordinary project. It's also a really stunning type specimen. On the top is a printed with metal type. It's a sermon that I'll talk about a bit later. If you see this in person, I would say it's very easy to tell that it's printed with type. You can feel the bite of the type in there. The one on the bottom is a little bit hard. It's actually a manuscript leaf from an album. It's modeled on Giovanni Cresci's writing book of the late 16th century. It's also kind of funny, if you read Italian, the heading at the top translates to cancelleresca, which is the handwriting style. Cancelleresca, made easier for nuns, which I think is very interesting and very, very specific. The one on the left is printed. It is a book of hours printed on vellum and then hand colored and with gold leaf laid on. I think that the border, it's on vellum, so the printing looks a little odd. I think the border in person is a dead giveaway. I work with a lot of students and none of them ever have a problem identifying this as printed. They kind of don't understand the painted part of it. But it comes at this moment when people in the early 16th century, people wanted hybrid books. So they wanted books that were printed, but still looked like manuscripts in some way. So the answer was these hybrid books. The one on the right is manuscript, and it's from an album, a really charming and sort of fantastical 1870s album. I think my photograph here isn't the greatest. So I think it's a little bit degraded. I think this is pretty stunning in person, and it's pretty hard to tell in person. I think it's sort of a little bit easier to tell online, but I'm not sure. These are both printed with metal type. The one on the left is a wedding announcement printed from Firmin Didot with a metal type that's quite beautiful, I think, and quite striking. It's pretty easy to tell in part because we expect wedding, and if you look at the text, I think we expect wedding announcements to be printed. Also, the typeface, I think it's quite perfect looking. The one on the left, for some reason, that is also printed with metal type. I always get confused and think this is engraved. There are a lot of engraved books that look quite similar to this, but it is printed with metal type. The one on the top is a bit of a trick. It is the decorated initial is printed, and then the rest of it is manuscript. If you're keeping track, this was one of the hands that French children were encouraged to learn in the 16th century. They were encouraged to learn like 14 or 15 different styles of handwriting, but some of them were just for fun. I do have a lot of jokes about how awesome or possibly terrible it would have been to be a child in 16th century France. So this one's difficult. I would say that if you look at this in person, you can see the ink on the page, and I'm more curious often as to whether people can figure out if those initials are printed. The one on the bottom is manuscript. This is kind of a favorite of mine. First of all, he tells you that he does it with a pen. I'm interested in this one because every time I show it to colleagues or anybody, they can never believe that it's manuscript. I actually think it's pretty easy to tell in person that it's manuscript, and also he tells you that it's manuscript. I think here it's just that people are so trained to see Roman lettering as typographic or printed that they just can't imagine that somebody would do letters like this. This is an 18th century English writing master named William Chinnery who tells you that he's done it by pen. He also tells you he did it in his shop as standing up at a public counter with lots of people coming and going, so it wasn't ideal circumstances. And he also says he didn't really use any particular method or model. So if you don't like it, just go do it yourself. So he's quite strident about it. But I think this is a pretty wonderful example. Here on the left, we have another manuscript book. This is done entirely by hand. This is interesting to me because if you just look at the lettering, I don't think it's that good. And I think you can tell, I mean, it's better than I can do, but I think you can tell that it's not printed, it's not typographic. But I think when you look at the initials and the border, that those things are actually better. And I find those things more confusing than the lettering itself. Somewhat the reverse, on the other side, we have Caxton's, we have the game and play of chess again. I guess I'd get a lot of use out of this. The reason I showed this, and this is a little hard to see online, this always confuses students, but somebody in the 19th century has ruled it in red lines to make it look like a manuscript or just to make it look more like a manuscript. So as it would have been ruled, and it always confuses students for some reason. Whoops. So this is a bit of a trick, I guess, because there are two different pages from the same book and one is printed and one is manuscript. This is the Aldine Dante from 1502, printed on vellum, again with decorated borders. And so this is one of the first instances of italic type. But one of the pages, I don't know what happened, it was missing, they needed a page, so someone just copied it out in manuscript and stuck it in there. Some people have suggested over my time at the Newberry that it was written out by Francesco Griffo, who was Aldis's punch cutter. I have never read anything to confirm or deny that. The one at the top here is manuscript. It's from a writing book, sort of a sample book by a young man in the late 17th century. If you looked at this, you would in person, you would 100% know that it's manuscript because you can really just see the ink on there. I think you can probably tell here too that it's a manuscript, but it is modeled on printed writing books like Edward Cocker's writing books, for example. The one at the bottom is probably pretty easy. It is a printed form printed in a sort of unusual and very early English script font. We actually have two of these, and they're slightly different typefaces. This one I thought was interesting because I think sometimes when you look at documents like this online, whether you're looking at them on microfilm or a copy, it can be kind of hard to see what's manuscript and what's print. Here it's pretty easy because the manuscript is a lot lighter and the writing is much different, but in some forms it's quite difficult to see. So I hope no one got the one at the top wrong. That is a letter from Michelangelo. It definitely is manuscript. The one at the bottom is sort of very odd. It's printed, it's script font, and this is just a postcard that someone gave me. I have not accessioned this into the collection yet. So I hope that was interesting for you. Here's the last one and the hardest one, I think. These are both printed. The one on the left is lithographed, and it's a collection called The Writing Reader that was in the 19th century meant to teach people how to read kind of messy styles of handwriting. So it's literally just hundreds of samples of handwriting from different kinds of people and different professions that have been lithographed, so you can get used to it. You can train your eye. If I had given you more of the book, you would have known that it was printed. Like if you had seen the running heads, for example, you would have known that it was printed. But I'm interested in technologies, how technologies influence the way we think about things. So lithography definitely in the 19th century changed the way that we look at handwriting. The one on the right is super interesting. It's this collection, it's called polytype. It's a process called polytype from the late 18th century, a French firm called, a Parisian firm called Hoffman that invented this process that quickly reproduced things. And you actually wrote on a plate with a special kind of ink that raised the plate, the surface of the plate, and then they could quickly print it. I need to learn more about the process. They actually showed this to Ben Franklin, and he tried it out and was totally astounded by it. So this is entirely printed. If you look at the thing in person, you can actually see a plate mark. Okay, so now I kind of just divided some stuff up into different categories to talk about that I thought were useful. For some of you, this will be like, you could be giving this talk yourself, but I think it's useful to kind of rethink about this every now and then. So we talked about, I think it's useful to state that all early typefaces were based on existing manuscript hands. They wanted books that looked like manuscripts, and those were their models. They weren't creating books out of whole cloth. They were making books that looked like other books. And I think that's useful. So was it fooling the reader? Not really, but kind of, sort of, maybe not. I mean, yes and no. They just there was a familiarity they wanted the reader to have. And so readers expected that if you picked up a law book, it looked a certain way, that if you picked up a Bible, it looked a certain way. I think the technology of the letter form was less important than the letter form itself. Here we have on the right side again is that Caxton page, which is from the 1480s. And on the left, I just grabbed, we don't have too many English manuscripts at the Newberry pre-1500, but here's a Thomas Hoccleve Regiment of Princes, which was early to mid 15th century, so not too dissimilar. I will say that I had a group of students in recently. They were in like a British Lit to 1600 class, and they wanted to look at some manuscripts and some early books. So I pulled these out. They'd never been to a rare book library before, never laid hands on rare books. They were super excited to try to read things. And they did such a good job and were able, with a little help, to do it. And what I thought was so interesting is they didn't think the manuscript, the handwritten thing, was any more difficult than the printed thing. They were both difficult for them because it was the letter form. The technology didn't bother them at all. It was actually the way in which the letters looked. But once they got used to that, they could navigate between these two things really easily. I'm going to go back to the Dante again. People always go on about how important all this minutiae was to the history of printing, because I hear people say all the time he invented italic. He didn't really. He invented italic type, or he was the first person to use italic. I wouldn't even say he invented it. He was the first person to use italic type, and he used it in a way that's different from the way we use it today. Today we use italic for emphasis. He used it to make very small pocket-sized books, really. And again, here is something that's kind of a hybrid book that's decorated very beautifully. But what I like to show students when they come in is that this too is modeled after contemporary Italian manuscripts, a contemporary hand. And when I first saw this book, I mean, this book, I will say, was so meaningful to me when I first started looking at it at the Newberry. And I just thought it was so beautiful. And I always remember thinking like, oh, why did they put those majuscules out in the margin like that? How innovative on Aldis's part that he would do that. And then eventually I realized that he was working off a model, which was Italian poetry. This was something, so on the right, we have a manuscript of Italian poetry a little bit before Aldis, but not too much. So this is what Italian poetry looks like in the time, and that's how the typeface, that's what the typeface is modeled on. So I find this really fun and useful to look at. Some people got pretty complicated. This was a book that I bought my first year as wing curator by Urban Wyss, who is a Swiss printer and writing master. This was based, so this is all metal type except for this bit at the top. And this bit right here, the swirly bits that you see are actually all metal type. It's incredibly complicated. It's a little bit like the Touradonc, if you know the Touradonc. It was very hard to do. It's based on his handwriting style. It was a little bit of a crazy endeavor, I think. But I'm still very happy to have it in the collection. Yes, I am obsessed with being a French child in the 16th century because a lot was asked of them. So here we have that ABC book from Christopher Plantin again. So we have that hybrid. It's also in this period of the 1550s that we get the first lettres françaises, or what we call civilité types from Grandjean, who based these types on a French style of handwriting. I always say Pierre Hamon, but I'm biased because I like Pierre Hamon so much. And this was so influential. I won't go into this because so much work has been done on this. You don't need me to tell you. It was so influential to French identity, French nationalism in the period. But also it was interesting that a lot of books published in Civilité were for children. And this went on through, this is from the 18th century, but it went on through the early 19th century. And one thing that I find so fascinating about Civilité is just that it's the type that lives in my head all the time, is there are lots of anecdotes from the 16th century, not just France, but I have seen them from England, where people said, I can read printed books, but not manuscripts. And it's fascinating to me because that's exactly where we are today. I deal with a lot of students who can't read or write cursive, but it doesn't mean they're not literate. They can read books just fine. They can read, they just can't read cursive. And so how do you solve that problem? And in the simplest sense, the French were like, well, we'll just make one style of writing, and then you just need to navigate one letter form. Now, I will also say that the French didn't print every book in this, obviously, and there were people who, even this book is not just printed in Civilité. But I think it's an interesting way of thinking about the issue of literacy, and I think that also complicates the idea of literacy as well. So it's something that I think about quite a lot. This is an English example of somebody trying to make something that really does look like manuscript. It doesn't really fit in with the French child, but I didn't have anywhere else to put this. This is a sermon. We looked at this at the beginning. And the idea was that if you needed to write a sermon but didn't have time, you could just buy a printed one that looked like a manuscript, and you would stand up in front of your congregation and hold this up, and everybody would be like, wow, he wrote that out by hand. The funny thing to me is it doesn't, so this really was attempting to fool the reader. Yeah. My colleagues have a joke. I bought this a couple of years ago, and my colleagues have a joke that there could be like a whole episode of Midsummer Murders where the vicar's alibi is that he was writing his sermon, but then it turns out it was printed. I don't think this would have fooled anybody, but these were very popular in England in this period. The vexed writing master. This is kind of my favorite category. So the one on the left is the first printed writing book by Gage. It's hugely important. It launched an industry. It's a wood block, so it's a relief printed. I don't know why it took people so long to start printing writing books. People in the 15th and 16th centuries always complained constantly, from like Erasmus on, that the printing industry, this new invention, was killing handwriting, and nobody wrote like they used to. And isn't it terrible? But the printing industry really, it saved handwriting in a way, or it made it more important. So first of all, the printing industry created bureaucracies, and they needed more clerks who could write. So who was going to teach all those clerks? Where were they going to get those writing masters? The other thing is that if you were a writing master and you had to copy something out by hand or make a copybook for somebody, you could do it by hand, and you'd have to do one and then another. And it was a very slow process. But if you could just print those, it would be a lot easier. You could do hundreds of copies at once, and you could send them far and wide. Now, far and wide was really important because in the early modern period, handwriting was kind of like a foreign language. Writing looked different in France than in Spain or in Germany. And also depending on your job, you might have a specific kind of handwriting. If you were a clerk, or you worked for the Pope, or you worked for the king, you'd have to know certain kinds of hands. And if you wanted to communicate with people in other countries, you had to at least know how to read that handwriting. Well, how did you do it? Well, so being able to print writing books allowed for people to send books all over. I put Michelangelo up because he was a student of Arrighi's. And what I also wanted to stop here because I think it's really funny that when a lot of people talk about how beautiful handwriting is in the period, and they talk about writing books, they'll always talk about like Arrighi's beautiful hand, or Barbador's hand, or Matero's hand. Even though there are manuscripts from those people, much of the time what they're actually talking about is the printed version of their handwriting. So when we say, oh, Arrighi's script is so beautiful, we really mean the woodblock is beautiful, not his handwriting. I think just something to think about. There's often a lot of tension within writing masters about print and manuscript. And this is something that is probably the most interesting thing that I'm talking about for me. So one of my favorite things is this book. This is a rare 17th century writing manual from Scotland by David Brown. Somebody along the way has created a manuscript title page, but it's not really trying to do anything except be informational. Brown spends the first part of his book talking about how nobody learns to write anymore. It's so terrible. Printing is ruining everything. You've got to learn to write. He can teach you to write. He can make everything better. And he gives very explicit instructions for how to make letters, how to make words, how to make ligatures. But he has to write in everything. So here he writes in how to make an A, how to make the Q, the G, the Y. He's written in various words on the right-hand side. At the end of the book, he has a note to the reader that says, sorry, I didn't make very many copies of these. I printed them myself, took a long time. It took extra long because I had to write in all the letters and words by hand. But if you like the book, let me know. Maybe I can do a second edition. And maybe by that time, I will have type. I'll have cursive type, or I'll have type that looks like letters. I'll have script type, not cursive type, but script type that looks like letters that I can use that will make the whole process go so much faster. So it feels just so ironic that he has just spent pages and pages and pages denigrating printing and the fact that nobody writes, but then he's saying, but it would actually make my life so much easier. And part of what I talk about when talking about fooling the readers, I kind of want to live, like, how do I get in his head? Like, what is it? Is he just too in it and he can't see that irony there? Or does the type not make a difference to him? Is it just making it easier and he expects people will know that it's supposed to be manuscript, right? If that makes sense. We see kind of the same thing in one of Edward Cocker's writing books. This is his model for one of the hands. So this is an engraved plate. It's very beautiful, very Cockerian, if that's an adjective one might use. At the end, he also gives instructions for writing the hands, making the hands, but he has more money than David Brown. He's a lot more successful. So he has these pieces of type that actually kind of look like the letters that he wants you to write. I mean, here we just have it throughout where I've squared it off in red. And I think this is really fascinating because it suggests to me that people just simply switched all the time between, manuscript and not manuscript. That makes sense. I don't know that made sense. What I started thinking about as I was even looking at this earlier today is that this, I think, is the way that we might use italic or bold today. I don't think he thinks this really looks like manuscript. I think he's just trying to call your attention to the fact that these are the letters that you should be considering. And it's just easier to do it with something that looks like script. He could have done it some other way, but it kind of is just easier on the eye this way, I think. By the time we get to the 1780s, though, not everybody does this, but I was really fascinated by this Isaiah Thomas writing book from 1785, in which there's no writing involved in the making of this writing book because he simply uses a script type for all of the examples. And so he's trying to teach you how to write using metal type. I said earlier that I was interested in how writing masters understood their writing being in print. And this book is a good example of how people might worry about it, or how people might worry about it. So this is a book by an early 18th century minor London writing master, John Clarke. And he includes a preface to the reader saying, it's really a problem for me that when people look at writing books today, they don't see the writing. All they see is engraving. They don't understand that somebody wrote this out and then it was engraved. They just think that an engraver sat down and engraved it. And he actually also includes a preface from George Bickham, his engraver, who talks about how hard it is to engrave writing books, and really, and how the writing master and the engraver needed to work well together, understand one another, and it was an important relationship. So people were clearly very worried that people couldn't see the handwriting in writing books, if that makes sense. So my next group is called Congratulations, You're Invited, Send Me Money. Sort of like the junk mail part of the talk. So I think we're trained when we see documents to just assume that they need a script font and that they're printed, right? We just recognize them today. Our eye recognizes that. This is an interesting one because it's such an early script font for England. I think that looks like this. That's the same thing. We also have hundreds, I'm interested in these hundreds or thousands actually, of German American birth and baptismal certificates that are printed and then filled in by manuscripts. So we have this hybrid here. I think we're just, again, trained to assume that a wedding invitation or a wedding announcement is going to be type, right? We just assume that it's printed in a script font. This is one of my 2 junk mail examples. This is a 1611 letter, ostensibly from James I of England, and he's asking for money for his military campaign in Ireland. Heather Wolf from the Folger has described this as like a 17th century charity request, 17th century junk mail. And it did make me think that a lot of charity requests I get now are in a script font that feel more personal. Do I think this, and this might have been in this typeface simply because it was coming from the king or on behalf of the king. Do I think that somebody read this and ran into their house to tell their wife that the king was depending on him to wage his campaign in Ireland? I'm not sure. This is something when I see it, I think it's obvious that it's printed in a metal type, and nobody else I show it to, who's not a type person, thinks that they all think it's manuscript. This, I hope everybody knows, is printed junk mail, possibly by the scan here to sell. This is I said earlier, I'm interested in the fact that students don't read or write cursive today, and yet there is such a proliferation of script fonts. Like even just in my Microsoft Word pull-down menu, there are like dozens and dozens of script fonts. So I'm quite interested. I've been quite interested in studying this one. Evolving technologies. There have always been technologies that evolve with script fonts. So here we have metal type. So Platt Spencer was one of the most famous American writing masters in the 19th century, but we get metal type that's called Spencerian. We talked about the lithography and the polytype printing. So as technology evolves, so do script fonts, I think. Things like photocomp and digital type. So here's Zapfino, that give things more texture, right? Make things easier to use, make things both easier and more complicated. And finally, I've been talking a lot about printed books that look like manuscripts, but what about manuscripts that look like printed books? So we've gone over this. This is Shakespeare. And this was a huge industry in the 19th century. So if people needed something, if we're missing a page of a book, they hired a copyist to make an exact copy of it. There was a man named John Harris who actually worked for the British Library, making facsimiles. And at some point, even he couldn't tell what was the facsimile and what was the original. So he had to start signing them. This one on the left is the manuscript facsimile of the first folio, a page in the first folio, and the one on the right is printed. There are books that were done entirely in manuscript for people. And again, this is because people wanted a book, like a model of a book that looked like the book. They just didn't want to copy. It wasn't about reading it. It was about the presentation of it. It was about holding it. I had a conversation with a reader the other day about how in 19th century sale catalogs and library catalogs, there were tons of these manuscript books for sale. I don't know that they were trying to fool people or not. I mean, I think they just wanted things to look as close to the original as possible. These are really quite lovely. These are by a man named Philippe Galland in mid 18th century France, Paris, and he very proudly says fait à la plume, so made by the pen. He's not trying to hide anything here. There's another man named Fio, two brothers, the Fio brothers, who were hired to copy lots and lots of things. I think this is a good example. This is a 16th century book. When you blow something up and put it online, it's actually easier because you can see, I think, how transparent or semi-opaque the ink is. This is something that just doesn't, to me, at all look printed. And again, it more looks like a manuscript. It's almost like, I think of this as like the Victor Victoria of books. Like, it's a manuscript looking like a book, looking like a manuscript. But to me, when I look at this online, I don't see a lot. It doesn't strike me as particularly printy. And we see that next to, again, this printed book of hours that also has some manuscript elements to it. Again, this is just a little prayer book. And I think when you blow them up, this is tiny. It fits in the palm of my hand. And when you blow it up, I think you can really see how imperfect the lettering is. You can see all the little tiny variations or mistakes. When you're looking at it when I'm looking at it in my hand, it's a lot harder to tell what it is. But people always, I think this tended to be just a service that writing masters and calligraphers provided for people. Even people like Crushy, early writing masters, always promoted their ability with the pen, their ability to make all kinds of letters, where they were drawn lettering or secretary hand or things like that. So I think this is something that's always existed. It was like a gap in the market that got filled for a long time. And this is one of the last thing that I'll show. This is a letter from Ralph Snow, the writing master, to his future father-in-law, telling him how he can just get any kind of work. And he just gives all these examples within the letter of the kind of writing he could do. So they were always promoting themselves. So I will end, that's what I have. I will end with this card that I was given the last time in New York, and I went to a super fancy restaurant for my birthday, and I got to the table and this card was sitting there, and it was clearly printed, and the chef had signed it on the bottom, and I was seething. Like, I was utterly furious because I was so mad that they would just give me a pre-printed card. But I looked around, and all of the other people who had birthday cards were like really excited, like, yay, the chef gave me a card. And so I know that I've gone over a lot, it's been a lot for me in my head too. I will just say that we live in this era in which I see fewer and fewer people in the library. That's because we've all lived through this time in which we do things remote. We can find a lot online. But I think it's important when thinking about letter forms and typography throughout time to really consider them not in a vacuum, and to think about them within the community they were created and the community they were created for, and to actually physically hold things in our hands and look at them and talk about them with each other. And I had, a couple months ago, I had a conversation with another librarian who really felt that the emergence of AI was repositioning libraries as a place where you could go to put your hands on something authentic. And I'm sort of curious about what people have to say about that, and if people continue to, if you feel like you can get things remotely, and if seeing things online or in person makes a difference to you. And I would just like to invite you to consider thinking about letter forms and typography, past, present, and future with me. And I hope that I will see you at the Newberry before too long.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jill. I really appreciate the context around everything you share, but also a great insight into the collection. I hope I definitely echo what Jill is saying. If you guys watching have a chance to go and visit and see the collection in person. But I also was kind of thinking about a couple of things. I'd love to just bring them up and see if there's a question sort of somewhere in there. And I encourage people watching to send questions if you have for Jill into the Q&A, and we can take those questions. I was kind of struck by this idea of how much the hand is ever present. I think that's like a really interesting idea when we think of type, metal type. We really think of it like as a very mechanical process and a very kind of mechanical object. But then if you think about the making of the type, it's a very hand labor, certainly up until the 19th century, and even then it's in the 19th century, but certainly even today, how much the hand is really drawing the type that's being made there. But then in essence, like the tension that you bring up, like the complaints about people not reading and how printing is kind of killing it. And I appreciate that the note that you made about that printing in a way kind of helped preserve the hand and calligraphy, because it never really went away. It was always sort of influencing and being kind of purposed and repurposed. It's this really amazing journey to see the interconnectedness of the hand. I had sort of one thought that came to mind in terms of the notion of writing out books in a way to make them look like type. It's certainly something that I think maybe hits kind of a high mark in the, I'd say 17th, 18th, probably more like 18th century with the royalty. But like, can you talk a little bit maybe about this idea of what would sort of drive high-end collectors, certainly kind of very wealthy kings, to have books that they would want to have written for them, and not so much like a manuscript, but manuscript type, like make it look.
Yeah, so I guess I would say that there are, I think, a couple ideas there. I'm fascinated by that too, because it seems like a lot of work, right? Like, it could be, for example, I mean, I think there are a couple of different things. It could be one, it could be just a book that's not available, like you can't buy it. So how do you get it? You make it, right? You have somebody make it for you. I think too, I think the idea of manuscripts never really goes away. I think I work on the 18th century, and I think manuscript culture is vastly understudied because people think by the 18th century, like it's all printed, it's all, but there were still, things that circulated by manuscript coterie. I think it was considered very high end. And I do think there's also something, I think, to the idea of something that is still bespoke, which I think connects to those printed books of ours on vellum that are then decorated, and they don't really look like manuscripts and are totally mass produced. But this idea that it can be exactly what you want, like you can have your coat of arms or you can have it decorated. And I think there's something like that just with manuscript books, that there's something to be said about bespokeness. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's like the sign of not necessarily wealth, but certainly kind of like a sign of status, right? Like being able to have your book illuminated is certainly accessible to fewer people. So like even if it's embellished in a small way or like a larger way, that definitely kind of signals like how your status.
I think you could also, it's a way of writing yourself into the book, like whether there's a dedication made specifically for you, or your coat of arms is on it. Or you could just direct, like, you could direct. There's a lot of work, I think, to be done on these manuscript books. And they feel personal in a way, even though they're completely impersonal. I think because we just take manuscript to mean, we always think manuscript is special and personal. Also, I think there's a skill involved. Like, I think anybody can write a secretary hand, right? I think it's quite hard. It is that command of the hand that is so interesting, that it's so hard in the books that mimic Roman type.
Mhm. Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about too, as you were speaking, this idea of counterfeiting, or I guess like more, like the more embellished, the more ornate, the more intricate the lettering, the writing, the calligraphy, the printing, definitely prevents it potentially from being counterfeited, or kind of gives it like a sense of authority. Like the more complicated it is, the harder it would be, especially if we're dealing with like legal documents, like ownership, the colonial expansion and kind of possession of territories, like all of these, like this is the city belongs to so and so, like a lot of these kind of deeds like become, and how interesting it might be. And I loved seeing that kind of the fundraising letter from a king, like that it's kind of that official language, but it's totally printed and um
Yeah. So first, I would say that writing that looks complicated to us, a lot of it was supposed to be complicated, right? If you're working in the papal chancery, your first of all, your writing had to look like everybody else's. There's no like adding personality to it. You had to look like everybody else's, but it's complicated for a reason, and it's complicated for certain types of script were complicated as an anti-forgery device, because if only very few people could write them, then you would have a very small pool of people who could forge them. And then, so that was a big deal. And I think it's also interesting to be able to recreate those things in print as well. I think there are lots of complicated issues there around that.
There's a question from Nick in the Q&A. And something I had also had a related sort of question. Nick's asking, does the Wing collection have many examples of newer kinds of mechanical writing? And you showed a few things in the end of your slides. For example, I know there's some kind of newer technologies for faking handwriting that use actual ballpoint pens that are controlled by computers. And he brings up kind of I think when he saw your images with junk mail, like some of the technology that's being used in junk mail to mimic the way that they would be handwritten.
Yeah, I'm really interested in those. We don't have a lot of that right now. I have been buying some things that like early carbon paper sets from the 19th century that were used to, like, you could use to copy your handwriting. Like, I'm interested in copying, but I've been really fascinated with those things. I see the advertisements for them all the time, in which it just converts your handwriting. And those are something I've almost clicked on those so many times for the collection. But I think if people write me and say they think they're interesting, I think that I would buy one if it's something that people want to see. I think that I am really interested in those, because I'm sort of curious about next generation of what that is too. Yeah. Thank you, Nick.
There's I've seen and I think this is like the idea of direct mail, kind of like the history of direct mail and marketing as it starts, probably. I mean, it starts probably a while back, but certainly kind of late 19th, and then certainly like a 20th century, 1940s, 1950s, like where as a sales tool, you would kind of let people know you might be visiting their town, and I will be making a call, like kind of door-to-door salespeople. And I've seen these like really fascinating little cards that I think initially were produced as a postcard that's handwritten. And I think you could go to a printer and buy pre-made ones that look like you wrote it out, filling in like a very kind of abstract, kind of generic kind of boilerplate stuff. I will be visiting you to sell you whatever.
We actually have some of those. We also have 1 million postcards at the Newberry and all of the production files of the Tyke Postcard Company. And they actually made some of those, and they're amazing. They're also, I mean, some of them are like, I'm having fun at camp, Mom. But I think that's really interesting too. Those pre-printed forms and stuff, I'm very interested in those.
I'll have to send you. I bought a few cards for our collection here. Like there's just a stamp postcard dealer, and I was kind of clicking through, and they have these pre-made advertising cards that I was looking for in their pharmaceutical design, but in that mix were a few of these like salespeople. And there's one fascinating one. I'll send you an image of it. It's a family moving. They move kind of across from one state to another, and it's like a child's drawing, like showing they're moving and kind of where they came from, where they're going, kind of this new address, but it's pre-printed in quantities. So this is like really fascinating, like not a sales tool. We're moving, and how do we get people to, like, it's this very fascinating idea, like you would maybe expect to see it today in the 21st century, but this is mid 20th century, this kind of charming child's drawing of a family moving.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I also have sort of thought that it might be interesting for a student or a designer, artist, or me, to think about what, like, a lot of these writing masters were entrepreneurs and taking advantage of new technologies in a way that when people do it today, we feel trepidatious about it. But then we look back and think like, oh, how wonderful Origi was, how wonderful and classic and important historically these things are. So I sort of would like to imagine, like, if Origi was alive or Louis Barbador was alive, what kinds of things would they be doing today to promote their writing, or their script styles? And yeah, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but I mean, something like that is actually, that kind of made me think about it, or that's super interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I was curious about, like just this idea of literacy, and kind of obviously these objects are the objects that you share kind of cross a spectrum of audiences. There's certainly kind of like the very high end, like the royalty, or people in a sort of
more of a general. I mean, I think that would be not necessarily, like, he's not saying it to other kings.
right.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, and I think like just the idea of like speaking to children too, like how, which does bring up like the notion of complexity of literacy, and how, I guess, like maybe dispelling the notion how literacy rates were, certainly kind of growing up as time goes on, but certainly not as grim as maybe sometimes we think.
So I will say that my exhibition and thinking about this has really helped me think about those issues of literacy, because, and my comment, which is totally serious, is that I wouldn't say that students today are illiterate because they can't read cursive. That's weird to me because it doesn't seem hard, but okay. But to think about the fact that there is a spectrum of literacy, and how do people deal with that? And do we need to reconsider what is meant by literate? I'm also really always surprised to find out, like, the other thing that I hear all the time is people say, like, women didn't learn how to write, women didn't learn how to read. There's lots of writing books. If you're an Italian nun, you're learning Cresci's Cancelleresca. There were writing books for women by women. So I think looking at writing books and these kinds of materials, and also looking at stories of who owned books and how they read them and what kinds of things they were able to read, it really does open up new ways for me into thinking about the history of reading, the history of printing. So I think there's always, I think sometimes when I talk to students who do typography, they're very interested in the formal qualities or what the letter, kind of what the letters look like, what they're doing. And I think it's just really important to kind of widen out and thinking about them not in a vacuum, but how they interact with all these other kinds of printing around it and writing around it. So
Yeah, hopefully encourages others to research and do some of the writing. The collections, there's so much material out there. I hope people kind of get curious about these things. And maybe the last question, since we're almost at 2 o'clock Eastern, this idea that just kind of in terms of the materials, kind of make me think of stencils. Like we just last week with the students talked kind of about the history of stencils, like the 17th century idea of stencils, which is also just kind of another mode of being able to do writing kind of in more mechanical ways, but certainly kind of created a particular space of being able to do something that looks like type or potentially kind of resembles that, but is easier to do than having to hone.
yes. So had I not cut the entire George Salter part out of my talk, and you're welcome because I'd still be talking. He does some fascinating kind of stencily type things too that I think is fascinating. But yeah, stencils are something that I think are worth thinking about.
There's you and Clayton and I have this kind of back and forth about some of the this idea of fooling. We kind of have this going thing of like what looks like type. And he showed a manuscript. It was in a collection, an exhibition somewhere, I think in Italy. And it's a document that Rousselet produced. And it looks almost identical to all the other work that Rousselet does, like very beautifully constructed Roman lettering, Roman minuscule. And so it looks like printed type, but then if you really kind of zoom in and look closely, you can see kind of the telltale sign of what you were saying. Like usually you can tell his ink, like it's a little bit more transparent and kind of can see like the stroke connections. And this one's like you could see the overlap of stenciling. So like a very prolific writing master, highly sought after, obviously also probably quite expensive to get work from him. And here's an example of stenciling, which always makes me wonder, like, was this just like a quick job? Was the budget too low? But like just kind of fascinating that it's signed, it's credited to him, but the book itself completely is produced by stenciling.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I haven't actually thought about stenciling too much, but it is a really interesting way to think about reproduction, that sort of mechanical reproduction.
Yeah. Amazing. Folks, everyone, first and foremost, Jill, thank you so much for a great walk through the collection. Also, like very, very particularly interesting lens to go down a path of the hand and writing and calligraphy and type. Hopefully folks watching could get inspired. If you wanted to watch the talk again, I posted the link to YouTube. You can watch this again and it'll be available on Vimeo. But thank you, Jill. Thank you, everyone watching.
Yeah.
We will see you hopefully on the 4th and certainly in the new year. But have a great rest of the day, everyone. Wonderful week. Jill, thank you again. Thanks a million for being with us.